everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. It is the top of the hour, so we'll go ahead and get started. This meeting is being recorded and will be posted to our website at northcentralclimate.org within about a week to 2 weeks of this session. There will be a poll at the end of Dr. Wise's presentation, and did want to let you all know that that will be coming. There won't be the poll to start like we do sometimes, as I forgot. So that's the reason for that. Anyway, very honored today to have Dr. Kiersten Wise here with us, reporting out of the University of Kentucky, a leader in the crop protection network, and she's going to be telling us a little bit about that network today. You can see the talk title there, and I'll just hand it right over to Dr. Wise.
All right, well, thank you, Hans, and thank you all for coming today and for allowing me to give you a little bit of an introduction into the Crop Protection Network, who we are and what we do. And also, I want to take a little time today and talk about some of the tools that we have that allow us to quantify the impact of some of our field crop diseases. I'm a plant pathologist here at the University of Kentucky, and so I'm really focused on field crop diseases, which is part of my role in the Crop Protection Network. And I think that we've done a good job of really showing how we can put data and numbers to some of these disease issues that can then be used to try and project the impact of things like climate on some of our future or emerging disease issues. And so with that, I'm going to just talk a little bit about the Crop Protection Network. If I was in a room with you all, I would ask you all, raise your hand if you've seen, if you've interacted with the Crop Protection Network before. But if you haven't, this is just a picture of our website. And just in a nutshell, we're an extension resource. We are a land-grant university output, and it's really for a multi-state sort of field crop pest management information. And it's free. We always like to emphasize that to all of our stakeholders, that it is a free resource. We're just another extension type of group providing that high quality, unbiased research-based information that farmers and stakeholders need. And we do that in a variety of formats that we'll talk about a little bit later. But usually when I start talking about the Crop Protection Network, everybody sort of asks, well, like, how did this group come about? And there's been sort of a resurgence of our superhero type narratives in movies over the last couple of years. And all of the good ones start with an origin story. And I always like to take a few minutes and talk about the Crop Protection Network's origin story, because I think it's kind of interesting. And like all good origin stories, when you think about a superhero, it usually comes about because of some, event or natural disaster. And Crop Protection Networks is kind of the same way. Really, our origin story begins with a hurricane, a natural disaster, which was Hurricane Ivan, that happened way back in 2004. And this is important, this natural disaster, apart from being very damaging to the Southeast, it also is what is suspected to have brought the disease soybean rust to the United States from Central and South America. And I don't know if any of you remember soybean rust, if you've at all been tangentially across the field crop world, but back in the day, this was a really big deal. So soybean rust was incredibly devastating in Brazil and places where they grow soybeans in South America. And the potential impact of this disease to the United soybean crop was just a real threat. And there was an unprecedented extension effort to make sure that farmers knew about soybean rust, knew how to control it. If it was going to take off, they would have tools to manage it. And so what was kind of coming out from this was that there was a big effort to develop these resources, but soybean rust wasn't established into the US yet. And all of the information was coming from Brazil and Central America. And almost all of these fact sheets that were coming out, they all said the same thing. And so all of those plant pathologists, we all started looking at each other and saying, why are we all doing the same work when we're all saying the same thing? Would it be better use of our time to coordinate? We could reduce duplication. And there's something, strong about having and speaking with the same voice. So could we have a stronger message if we're combining our efforts and speaking with one voice? And so in the field crop world, this was really sort of a new era. And there was a lot of efforts to try to do this, and some really successful outputs that you see here. So some of these kind of multi-state publications, there were some mapping efforts that kind of live on to this day in different forms. And really, when you think about a collaborative effort, it really was successful. A lot of the plant pathologists were contributing to these efforts. But all of us who are in extension, we all have to think about impact, right, in our reporting. And so then really those logistical hangups really started to come into play. Like, where are we going to locate these resources and how are we going to brand it? Are we all going to put all of our university logos on it, and get what one of my former colleagues at Purdue called the NASCAR effect, where we all have our logo on it? So it sort of like waters down the impact of any one logo. And the location issue is really big too, because, in extension, a lot of us don't necessarily have the infrastructure in place to house a lot of these outputs. And so it can be an issue if I'm telling farmers in Kentucky that they need to go access this output and it's on an Ohio State website. They're going to wonder, okay, well, is it really Kentucky information or information that's relevant to me? And so those were some of the logistical challenges to some of these multi-state outputs. And as a plant pathology group at the time, we looked at some of the other existing infrastructures that were in place and how we might do it, but nothing really worked for our specific purposes. And so we did sort of what the old adage is, if you can't find a way to work around it, you build your own, right? And so in 2014, that's what we did. We just sort of built our own national network that can serve as an infrastructure for a lot of these types of outputs, called the Crop Protection Network. And so if you see that logo, that's encompassing all of the land grant universities that participate. And those are all on the website, acknowledged, but it just kind of cleans it up by having one tidy logo that you can put on a publication. And so when we think about this, really our target audience with Crop Protection Network are going to be the stakeholders: farmers, certified crop advisors, industry, a lot of the county extension in various states, and a lot of other people in field crop agriculture. They can get all of our information, which again follows the tenets of extension. It's unbiased, it's accurate, it's research-based, and that's what we've really become known for at the Crop Protection Network. All of ours, it doesn't negate the need for that state-specific resource, because this is going to be information that's on affecting multiple states and areas, but any specific state commentary is still needed by the individual. And we just try to provide this information in a lot of different formats, and some of the tools that we'll talk about. So to date, this has been more successful than I thought it would be. You can see, this is sort of our map that we like to put out that shows that, we have really good national participation in most of the states where they're producing corn and soybean. We have specialists that contribute, along with wheat and now alfalfa as well. And we also have, it's international. We have some of our collaborators from Ontario are also participating. And, for some of the people who might be affiliated with an institution or the USDA or some of the groups that contribute information, we also like to advertise that there's a benefit to doing it. And we've established that benefit, and that's why we have so many collaborators. And some of those benefits, if you go back to impact, are things like all of our content has a DOI, and we have those metrics so that if you're contributing to the Crop Protection Network, we can get that impact tracking back to you for your annual reporting. And, the easy one that we talked about was soybean rust. It really reduces that duplication. Instead of having each state having a general fact sheet for every disease, we have a lot of those available here that we can all contribute to and reference. And everybody, gets an opportunity to review it so that way they can make any modifications that are needed so it's relevant to their state and they can feel good about showing it to their stakeholders. And one of the things that, we'll talk about with some of our impact tools is that it also is really helpful when we're trying to justify what we're doing, justify why these diseases are important or why some of this research is needed. We have the way to summarize that and to get that out to our contributors as well. I always like to point this out that if you haven't heard of CPN, you've probably still seen our content. So like all good extension tools, a lot of our content gets repackaged or reposted by other groups. And these are just a few of them that use some of the tools and the outputs that we have. There's many more, but I always point that out that you might not have heard of us or gone to our website directly, but it's very likely that you've seen some of our tools or outputs through some of the other sites that maybe use it or repackage it. And when we started, a few years ago, our main outputs were primarily things like publications and a broad range of those types of publications. But really now we've been able to diversify into a lot of different outputs, not only publications, but things like the web books. We have a webinar series. We have a fun podcast called I See Dead Plants that's gained some traction, our newsletters, and again, all of this sort of covers the pest management issues for corn, soybean, wheat, and alfalfa. Now, I often get asked about some of these, and so I'm just going to take a few quick minutes to highlight some of our key outputs that a lot of people like to use. And so if you aren't aware of these are some of the tools that are available. The first is probably one of our more impactful outputs. We call them encyclopedia articles. They're just short little profiles on a lot of the pest managements, and we have these for both diseases and some insect pests as well. The real key takeaway for these is that there's a lot of pictures. And so if you're ever putting together a talk, or if you need some resources that have pictures or images of a lot of these disease or insect issues, this is a really great resource. And they're all freely available. They're also available on Bugwood if you've ever used Bugwood. And so this is you can just use them with credit. And so we do see a lot of these out there in a lot of different ways. And so it's really short and sweet content that's really great if you have to give a talk or need some images for some publications. These are available to you. We also have some publications. If you ever need to know anything about a certain disease issue, we have what we call our overview publications. These are pretty in-depth, but again, it's everything you need to know about an issue. There's multiple pages, there's tips on distinguishing diseases and disorders. And if you're a certified crop advisor, you can read this, take a quick quiz, and if you pass, you get certified education or continuing education credits for reading these publications. One of our newer publication outputs is called a research review, and these are going to be where we're taking an article that's been published in a journal and we're rewriting it into non-technical language so that stakeholders can see the actual research that we did interpreted into a format that has none of the discipline-specific terminology associated with it. And we've had a lot of great responses from our stakeholder groups about these. They like to see the research that we're doing. They like to be able to see it not distilled maybe into a paragraph. They maybe want to read a little bit more about it. And so we have 7 of those that we've been putting out so far. And this is also one of those that's expanding. We have a lot of these in the pipeline because there's been a lot of demand for this type of output to try to get more of this out to stakeholders. So this is also another output that we have on the website. Now, our most popular offering as far as the publication side are going to be the fungicide efficacy guides. We update these annually, and we have them for corn, soybean, and small grains, mostly wheat. And there's a lot of research that goes into these ratings, and these are all extension specialists' feelings for or basically their research results put into how they think these fungicides perform against specific diseases. These are our most downloaded, our most repurposed outputs in terms of numbers, and they're very, very effective for our stakeholder groups. So those are some of the outputs that we have at the Crop Protection Network. Those are some of the things that we've evolved to do. And I'm going to shift gears a little bit now and talk something about what we how we use a lot of these outputs and the tools that we have on the website to track the impact of diseases. And so just kind of tying it in a neat bow with soybean rust, I mentioned that there are these tracking systems, and Extension has some really good systems in place to monitor diseases. And some of these are through the IPM pipe that you see here, so these are our sort of real-time tracking websites that we use to monitor where disease is in a given season. And that tells one part of the story, right? When we think about disease impact, is where it is, in a given year. But one of the things that we like to do at the Crop Protection Network is really look at how we can use some of those data, and also the impact data in terms of yield loss, to look at the long-term impact. And when we're using all these data sets and these tools, these are going to be available to other scientists to examine trends or analyze broader effects of things on disease impact. So it really fits in well in the climate setting, because this is sort of a way that we can look at how changing climate impacts how diseases move, how they spread, and how they cause yield loss. And so some of the tools that we have available can help with a lot of that. And what I really like about these tools is that it helps actually put numbers to statements that we all hear in Extension. Some of those statements like, this was a really bad disease year, or I'm starting to see more of this disease than I saw in the past, or I really had a lot of disease in my field. And all of those statements can be true. But when we think about what does that mean, especially when we're trying to tie in other factors like climate or production practices into it, and we're trying to examine the roles that those play on diseases, we're not able to do that with these sort of vague general terms. And so at the Crop Protection Network, we have tools available to quantify what a lot of disease is and to collect those data. And so I want to spend a few minutes talking about what we have and how we use it, and give you a few examples of some of the ways that it can be used to help put some terminology and some data to those claims of a lot of disease. So I'm going to focus mostly on our disease and insect loss estimators here. And this is really kind of a new tool. It's been around for a few years, but we've actually had a lot of disease loss data for many years, then we just haven't been able to get into an effective way that people can use it more broadly. And now we do have that. And so I think that's really interesting. And if you've ever used like the USDA, crop calculators, if you're looking for production values or statistics, ours on the website works in a very similar way. If you go to the tool setting on the website, you'll go to the disease loss calculators. And you can see here that there's a lot of different parameters where you can search. There's years, there's categories of disease, you can search for a specific disease, and you can search by state, or you can just get a broad range of the whole US, however you want to start searching. And just as an example, I pulled this up. This is one just to kind of illustrate how this works. This is northern corn leaf blight. It's an important foliar disease of corn. And if we're entering sort of some inputs into that calculator, what it pulls up in our range of years here, 2018 to 2020, you can look at the impact northern corn leaf blight has had in terms of yield loss, and in terms of percent loss, in terms of bushels lost, the dollar value, the total dollar value loss, and the dollar value per acre. And so those are all some really good statistics and some good data values to actually show the impact that this is having. So how much is lost? And then we also have tools here you can see with our maps that you can see where it was lost as well. And so you can visualize, all of these different types. This is just an example here of the bushels lost. But again, it answers those two important questions that I think are really important on how much was lost and where was it lost. And that helps us understand, again, how shifting things like climate or production practice, what value they're having on impact and where people are feeling that impact. There's a few other data visualizations that we have available on the website, so you can look at it graphically in a variety of terms. And then I always like to go back to the where is it having impact. We have some graphical representations of, based on the IPM center states, If you're seeing most of that impact in a given year in the north central area, in the northeast or the south, where that disease is having impact, it's very easy to see and to look at it over time and changes in some of these graphs that we have available. And so when we think about like kind of pulling climate into that, I always like to give the caveat that, when we start to see shifts in disease pressure, it can be due to many factors, production factors, hybrids that we're using or varieties that we're using. Things change from year to year. But when we're looking at it sort of long term and thinking about the changes that climate may be having on this, again, I go back to these tools are really good at showing two things. They're really good at showing how much impact for a given disease in a given crop, and they're really good at showing where that impact is occurring. And from those data, we can actually go back and overlay some of that climate data and see if there's trends or things that are happening that are causing those things to be linked. And the example I want to use that I think starts to illustrate that point is with gray leaf spot of corn. And you might say, well, gray leaf spot's not like a new or emerging disease, at least not in a lot of areas, it's not. But I would argue that we're starting to see more impact from the disease. And the reason that I can say that is because of the data that we have on this through these loss estimates. So the history of gray leaf spot is that it really was mostly just a problem in the Mid-South for a long time. It likes it hot and it likes it humid, particularly the humidity side of it. That leaf moisture is really what gets it going. It's a residue-borne disease, so as we have more continuous corn and as we have more no-till in certain areas, this disease becomes more of a problem. And this is how we used to graphically define our impact from diseases. So this is from our society, the American Phytopathological Society. And they had this map, and this was really 30 years ago. This was the best way that we could graphically describe our distribution for diseases. And the green area, that was what they were considering. If you were in that area, you might see some yield loss from this disease. And if you're in the yellow area, it's there, but in most years, it's not going to cause yield loss. And if any of you work with gray leaf spot, you'll say, wow, this looks really different now. And that's one of the things that we can use a lot of the tools on CPN to help visualize. And this is what it looked like in 2011. We're just kind of updating our map, our visual representation here by just kind of expanding those bubbles and saying, okay, well, now, it changed enough in about that 10 years or 20 years that it actually turned into wherever it's found, there's the potential for yield loss associated with it. And if we kind of fast forward another, about 10 years, we can look at it in a much better visual representation of those data. We're looking at 2018 here, and you're seeing all the states that reported in 2018, and you can see that sort of yield loss echoes that 2011 map where it's not just where it's present, it could be causing an issue, it's wherever it's been found. There are some very significant yield losses associated with it, particularly in areas that didn't used to have problems with it 30 years ago. And this is another way to kind of visually represent that. If you're comparing the 1992 map to the 2018 map, you can see here that, your north central area is experiencing a lot more yield loss and having a lot more risk than it used to in 1992. And so those are some of the ways that we can use these tools to look at, okay, well, what has changed in 30 years that's caused this disease to expand its range and expand its impact. So not only is it found in more places, but where it's being found, it's also having and causing yield loss. And so these are places where we can overlay things like production practices and climate into it to try to show what that impact is doing. And I will mention tar spot. It's a really hot topic, and it does fit really nicely into this as well when we talk about, in particular, those two questions of how much damage is it causing and where is it causing the damage, and how the CPN data can help answer that question. So tar spot, if you don't know, it's a pretty new disease in the United States. In 2015 is when it was first reported in Indiana and Illinois. And it was sort of interesting at first, and it wasn't really sure what was going to happen. And for the first few years that it was in the US, it didn't really cause yield loss. It was there, but it wasn't until 2018 when it had built up and there was enough of it around and the environmental conditions were right. And then we started to see it kind of blow up in some of these areas. And now, it's found across those north central states and it's all the way east as Pennsylvania. We found it in Kentucky last year for the first time, and it's been found as far south in Georgia and Florida. And so it's got a broader distribution now. And that has a lot of concern about what type of impact it could be having in some of these other areas. And I know that you all probably have heard, some of those stories of the double-digit yield losses from tar spot. And so it is one that, being able to visually represent how much you're losing and where you're losing it is really important when you think about documenting the impact of the disease. So answering that first question, how much impact, we can use our disease loss calculator to really look at how much impact tar spot is having. And if you look at it from the year it was first reported, 2015, till last year, you can see, just like we talked about, it took a few years for it to really build up steam and to get established before we started to see yield loss. I always like to show this because I always think this is a really good example of some of our plant pathology principles, that some years it's going to be more favorable for the disease than other years. And it just happens in 2021. It was a very favorable year for tar spot and there was a lot of impact. And so I think that's where a lot of the concern comes from when you have sort of those devastating yield impacts. That, again, this yield loss calculator really helps put those numbers together on how much impact is it having. And then it also is going to help visualize where this impact is occurring. And so when we think about it, it's in a lot of different states, but where they're almost, when they have yield loss impact, a lot of times it's going to be sort of in these 4 states where it's been established the longest and it has the right environment for conditions to be favorable for the disease and severe disease loss. And so I really like these maps because when I talk to people in Kentucky, these maps help me to show them where they're experiencing the greatest impact from this disease. And it's not necessarily in our area right now, but it's right up here. This is where they're seeing that yield loss impact. And so these are some of the ways that these calculators can help visualize and provide those numbers that help tell that story. Another good story on this, and I'm going to make sure I emphasize soybean as well, not just corn, is that frog eye leaf spot is another one of these stories where it really was only a disease that caused problems in the southern states. It likes it, again, really warm, lots of humidity, which we have in spades down here in the southern states. But now we're starting to see it expand its range and distribution and have more impact in northern states. And again, for a few years, this was just something that we said and didn't really have the numbers to back it up. But now that we have these disease loss calculators and estimates, you're able to visualize. So this is 2018, and you're seeing, South Dakota, a state that I think of as not really a humid state, is seeing a lot of impact from a disease that is problematic in warm, humid climates. And so these are things that really we need to start exploring, is what that role of climate is and how it's impacting this disease, because we're seeing that expansion, we're seeing that range expand, and with it, the impact is expanding too. And just another kind of visual representation of that, again, if you look at a given year, a lot of impact still is occurring in the South, but it is alarming when you're starting to see more of these north central and northeastern states that are experiencing yield loss and impact from a disease that's traditionally been confined to the southern states. Now, I talked a lot about how we can visually sort of show a lot of that impact, but if you're also just looking for the traditional type of publication, we have that available. We summarize kind of a write-up in a couple pages, 2 to 3 pages, of what these losses were every year, and that's available on our website as well. And one of the nice things about these publications is that it also allows us some space for narrative. So if there were particular environmental conditions or something specific that had an impact in a given year, that's summarized in these. So these, along with the outputs that you're getting from the calculator, can really tell a nice story about how disease impact has changed over time, and what's influencing that impact. So I want to just take a couple minutes and talk about, what's coming down the pipeline. So what are some of these next disease threats, things that we're picking up on our radar that are picking up in the disease loss estimates, but aren't really causing yield loss or documentable yield loss yet. And so these are some things that we need to be aware of. Particularly with changing climate, because the next three things that I'm going to talk about, these diseases are all diseases that are problematic in more tropical areas. And so the fact that we're seeing them emerge and become problematic in some of our states now, again, sort of lends to that question of how is this changing climate impacting our disease and emerging diseases. So Diplodius leaf streak is the first one. It's now annually prevalent in the Mid-South, and it's kind of creeping up into the Midwest. I know they're starting to see it in states, maybe even as far north as Michigan. My colleague up there has thought that they've seen it as well. And it's a very common disease in South America. And to date, it's been confined to the lower canopy, maybe up into the mid canopy of corn. Maybe at the end of the season, but no farmers have really thought that it impacted yield from the foliar phase of the disease. But the interesting thing about this is that the fungus that causes Diplodia leaf streak also can cause a Diplodia urate. And it's a different fungus than the one we typically think of as causing Diplodia urate. And so this means that there's just more out there to cause foliar disease, and also the urate phase, which does have some impact on yield and could potentially cause issues with grain quality as well. And so this is one we're keeping a really close eye on to try to see how it's emerging and if or when it's going to cause yield loss and impact problems. Another one on corn that's gotten a lot of attention over the last few years is curvularia leaf spot. This was first reported in the United States. It was a brand new disease to the United States. It was first reported in 2017. And now it's sort of expanded from that southern tier of states. It's up into Kentucky, and it's over as far east as Delaware now. And this one is really important and important to keep an eye on as well, because there are some countries where tropical areas, this is one of their most important and yield limiting diseases. So we're watching very carefully to make sure, that we have an eye on curvularia, because with some changes in climate or environment, this one could really take off and potentially cause some yield issues, like it has in other countries that have a more tropical climate. And so again, it's only been reported for a few years, since 2017. And so we're kind of waiting to see if it does something like what tar spot does, where it takes a few years, it gets established, and then we get the right environment and it really takes off. So another one to keep on your radar. And then finally, in soybean, red crown rot is one that is really important to kind of pay attention to. Again, it's one that was sort of just a minor disease in some of our southern states, but now it's as far north as Illinois. And a lot of our colleagues have been monitoring yield loss for this disease since about 2018. And the first year that it really popped as causing substantial and measurable yield loss was this last year in 2021. And so another one to kind of keep an eye on as it starts to gain some traction and cause more yield loss. And again, having these loss calculators, having these data that allow us to sort of quantify and put numbers to how much is lost and where it's being lost is going to help as we document the impact of this and the other diseases. And so I hope I made a case for why, some of these tools can put some numbers to these statements, but there's one more that I want to just emphasize as I finish up here. And that we talk about the disease and insect loss estimators, and that gives us sort of the broad overview of how these things are influencing the impact. But I also want to talk about it at the field scale, because we do have some tools that can help with estimating severity. So if you're wondering what a lot of disease looks like in a given field, we have some tools that can help with that as well. So we call these our disease severity tools, and it's just a way to sort of train your eye to be able to estimate how much disease is out there. And so my example here, this would be frog-eyed leaf spot. You can see there's a tool and there's like a little game you can play, and you can slide the bar over and you can increase or decrease the amount of disease. So you can kind of see, okay, well, this is what 20% disease looks like on a leaf. And there's even a quiz that you can take that will give you images and you can guess how much disease. So it's a really great tool to use to train yourself to be able to estimate what disease looks like, so you can be more accurate and have more accurate values when you're talking about what is a lot of disease or what is a little bit of disease or how much disease, and then how does that line up with the impact that it's having in yield. And so these are all just tools that sort of help us get some more numbers and define that impact in a broader way. Now, I talk a lot about the disease part of it because I'm a plant pathologist and disease is where my interest lies. But we've really started to expand this over the last couple of years. So we have more of our entomology colleagues involved. And so we do have some insect loss estimates. Now, right now, it's just for the southern states, for a lot of the insect pests for the southern states, but we're working on expanding this up into the north central states as well. And so stay tuned, because we will hopefully have some more insect pest loss estimates that we can do similar things with, like we're doing with the disease, to try to examine the role that some of these other factors are playing on not only where the impact is occurring, but how much impact is occurring. And the same with our severity estimator for diseases. We have a similar defoliation training that you can take to examine how much damage is occurring from a particular insect pest. And so it works in a very similar way, but it can just help improve the accuracy and put some numbers to some of those things that we're seeing. So as I sort of wrap this up, I just want to kind of mention, just as an overview, the Crop Protection Network, we have a lot of offerings. It's a good example of, a long-term and in very large-scale university collaboration. And I think it's got some really innovative things that we're trying to do. In particular, these tools, and that I've highlighted and maybe even beat to death in this talk, that we have these tools. They can provide those values, they can provide those numbers, and it gives us more of an idea of the impact these things are having, so that we can talk with a more robust way about what types of impacts they're having when we're trying to overlay things like climate and production practices over on top of these numbers. And so I would encourage you to stay tuned, check out the Crop Protection Network. There's a lot more that we have in the works, and we'd be happy to take any feedback that you have on our outputs as well. And so with that, I always want to make sure I acknowledge, I'm just one member of the team that helps keep this thing going. And so I have a group of co-directors, Darren Mueller at Iowa State University and Albert Tenuta, who's with the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs. And then we also have a robust board of people that help contribute and keep us on track and do the heavy lifting so that we can get these outputs out to our stakeholders. And this wouldn't be possible without a lot of support that we have, not only from the USDA, but the North Central IPM Center, and a lot of our commodity groups like the National Corn Growers, the Grain Farmers of Ontario, the Soybean Checkoffs, and the US Wheat and Barley Scab Initiative. So we're really grateful for their support that allows us to get all of these tools out to you and our stakeholders. And so with that, I would be happy to answer any questions you might have.
All right. Thank you. We do have one question that was direct messaged to me, but before I ask it, I do want to let everybody know, since we are a smaller group today, I just enabled the ability for people to unmute themselves if they want to ask a verbal question at some point. The poll is going to go live as soon as I ask this question, so be on the lookout for that. The question is there any desire for the Crop Protection Network to encompass other pests such as weeds and nematodes, or is it confined to diseases and potentially insects?
Hans, that's a great question. And actually, I was just in a meeting with some weed scientists last week. And so our hope is that this year we'll start adding more weed science information to the crop protection network. And I'm very excited about that. And we do have some nematode offerings on there. So particularly things on soybean cyst nematode and root knot nematode. And I think we also are going to have some information on corn nematodes too soon as well. And so if they're sort of within our focus crops at this point in time, we're getting more information out there about them.
So Pam adds in the chat, she'd like to see it expanded to the Southeast. Do you have any plans to go further than regional with it?
So we actually do have a lot of our colleagues from the Southeast participate. So Bob Kemery in Georgia, Tom Allen and Trey Price in Mississippi and Louisiana, and Ed Sikora at Auburn. They are all contributors. They all provide a lot of input on our outputs and also contribute to those disease loss estimates. So we do have some, but Pam, if you have some specific people that you would like us to contact or get involved, just please let me know. We'd be happy to reach out to them.
All right, I'm going to leave the poll open for just about 30 more seconds. So if you haven't filled that out, please do. There's only 2 questions. It doesn't hurt yet. Does anyone else have any questions for Dr. Wise today? I'll ask one question, and if it's curveball, I apologize ahead of time. But in the pathological research world, have there been any diseases that have come to light in the last 20, 30 years, which the community has been able to kind of blame on climate change? Is there any direct disease or pest that we would say, yes, that's definitely here now because of climate change?
Yes, so definitively, I have to sort of walk a fine line, right, by saying like we can definitively blame this one on climate change, right? But I would say those 3 that I put up at the end, those are probably 3 that I would say all of the markings of their emergence and spread really sort of, to me, look like climate change. And those were Diplodia leaf streak, curvularia, and red crown rot. And those are all, like, particularly curvularia, it's a tropical disease. It's a disease that was never in the US before and really shouldn't be here if we think about the climate that we had 30 years ago. And so that's one in particular that I think this is really a red flag. And I'm really alarmed because if things continue to sort of progress into more heat and humidity, it has the potential to really become like a tar spot and really cause a lot of yield, because where it is established in some of those tropical growing areas, it is just devastating. It can wipe out whole crops. And so that is definitely one to kind of keep an eye on, and that I think you could make a strong case for climate being a big motivator or impact on why we're seeing it now and how it might change in the future.
Thank you. Last call for other questions. Well, I will make a quick announcement. Pam and I were doing just some light chatting while we were 90% paying attention to the presentation. And there is, for the extension folks on the line, the NACA, National Association of County Ag Agents meeting coming up in Florida. And Pam Knox with the University of Georgia is going to lead a climate super seminar at that event. The link to the annual meeting and professional improvement conferences in the chat right now if you want to check it out. And since we haven't had any other questions, we'll go ahead and call that a wrap. Really appreciate your time today, Dr. Wise. It's excellent presentation. And yeah.
Well, thank you, Hans. It's my pleasure.
Hope to see everybody at the next one in 2 months.
Thank you all.